Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, if John Hancock were alive today, he'd say, the Greeks are gone, people. And I say, we're all Greek now. Yeah, we're all goners. Let's talk to Stacey Herbert and find out more. Stacey?
Max, yes. Well, you know, austerity has been the biggest catchword of this whole entire financial crisis. We've seen Greece on the verge of bankruptcy and a huge imposition of austerity. We see it everywhere, and of course George Osborne is about to announce in July some new round of austerity. But I saw a piece talking about austerity in relation to the American Revolution, and the headline reads, 1776, the revolt against austerity. In 1763, in England, they had 122 million pounds in debt. That was 150% of GDP, debt to GDP. Right now, by the way, it's 90.6% debt to GDP, and they're imposing austerity. But there was a huge debate going on at the time here in England. Do we impose austerity on the colonies, where a lot of their wealth was coming from, or because here back home, everybody was sick of high taxes? So they did. They imposed a proclamation line of 1763. They were subsidizing immigration to the U.S., and they stopped at the colonies. They also introduced the 1763 Hovering Act, the Currency Act of 1764, so that the U.S. could imprint their own currency and escape the austerity. They also, for example, forbade trade with anybody but England, so they couldn't trade any longer with the colonial Spain, for example.
So I guess the point being that austerity led to the American Revolution. Austerity from England that suddenly, after years and years of promoting the colonies by giving them some tax breaks and by encouraging the growth of the population, they suddenly decided to impose austerity.
Yes.
And the colonists at that time decided that, well, you know, maybe it's time for us to stage an Declaration of Independence.
A lot of this actually was in the Declaration of Independence, and the article notes that the wealthy Boston merchant and prominent signatory of the Declaration, John Hancock, thought the new policies were, quote, very cruel and would soon make the Americans a gone people. Contemporaries believe that British manufacturing exports to America had declined by 3/4. Most Americans were certain that the multifaceted economic contraction of 1764 to 1769 had everything to do with Prime Minister Grenville's austerity, which the American founders described as, quote, a history of repeated injuries and usurpations.
You have two examples today of countries facing similar situations. You've got Greece, as you mentioned, that's being subjected to austerity from the Germans after allowing them to enjoy the benefits of being part of the euro. And when that happened, Greeks suddenly had a huge windfall, including the Olympics. But then the Germans decided, you know what, we're going to start imposing austerity, and their best course of action for Greece would be to declare independence. But we also see it in Scotland. Scotland has been subjected to austerity from Westminster, and they had a referendum, and they voted against independence. Then the SNP rose up in power because it was clear that the so-called deal made between Westminster and Scotland was not going to be honored. And now they're going to shoot for another referendum, another vote on independence. And it looks good that they will declare independence and they will follow America as somebody who escaped the onerous, draconian debt schemes.
Of course, it was physical hot wars. Right now, we have the class war that Warren Buffett, one of the richest men, always talks about, that he's winning, their class is winning, the top 0.1%. And because we bailed out the banks, the debt in this country, for example, went from an average of 50% of debt to GDP for the past decades to now 91%. In Greece, it's 175%. But back then, again, there was, before the revolution, before the Declaration of Independence, and we see that a lot now, there's declarations of independences going on, and there's calls for revolution.
But there's additionally, aside from the austerity imposed by this wealth redistribution from the many to the plutocrats, there's also been a redistribution of rights and laws. So now we have, in the UK, rights are being taken away from people as well as their wealth. And the legal system is now two-tier, where if you have a certain amount of money, you're part of the plutocratic class. You have a separate legal system where a lot of stuff is okay to do, but is not okay. And we just saw it in the situation where Barclays Bank and other banks were caught criminal law breaking, and they were given a pat on the back. And for everyone else, of course, not in the plutocratic class, they would go to jail.
Well, of course, those closest to the king over here back in England, not in the colonies, were of course able to speak to him and say, yes, impose austerity on those people way far away, even though they're creating all the wealth. And the debates were raging. William Pitt on one side, the Grenville, who was the prime minister, on the other side. And on the side of the Americans, the patriots, was John Locke and also Adam Smith. But first they said that, what alternative strategy did the authors of the Declaration propose? Today we tend to regard the practice of using government spending to stimulate economic growth as an invention of John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. But already in the 18th century, self-styled patriots, followers of William Pitt on both sides of the Atlantic, argued that what the British Empire needed if it was to recover from the fiscal crisis was not austerity, but an economic stimulus. In the midst of the crisis, one journalist wrote that Pitt and the patriots believed that the burgeoning debt could be reduced by increasing the national stock, or gross national product, whereas Prime Minister Grenville believed that 140 million of debt is to be paid by saving of pence and farthings.
Right, austerity has many names. You can call it discrimination. You can call it apartheid in South Africa. In other words, this idea of austerity in our modern era takes the form of what I call interest rate apartheid. And in America, they don't call it austerity, but if you try to get any money, they're going to charge you 20, 30, 40%. Here in this country, you try to borrow money from a payday lender, it's 2,000, 3,000% annualized rates of return. If you're part of the plutocrats, if you're part of the privileged class that's being handed money at 0% interest ad infinitum, no strings attached, your interest costs are zero. So it's austerity through interest rates, which is a point that the unions in this country don't understand. The left in this country doesn't understand. Labor politicians don't understand. They still think we live in the 19th century where it's about negotiating wages, and that era has long gone.
So the British Empire had subsidized immigration, and John Locke was saying we need more immigration to the colonies. Of course, right now what you see in the U.S. and here is a crackdown now on immigration, or chatter about like cracking down on immigration. Of course, there was 318,000 more immigrating into the UK last year than emigrating. And that's probably the only reason why the UK even had any marginal growth. But now they want to crack down on it for austerity reasons. But the other thing that was interesting that I had no idea about is looking back at the Declaration of Independence and all the writings of the actual founders of the United States of America, was that they were really against slavery. And the King George III, would not allow them to end it. I guess because a lot of the slave trade came through here and they were making money on the rentier of renting the slaves out. But many of the founders had also come to appreciate that a system of chattel slavery made no economic sense at all, since it would replace potential consumers with unfree laborers who could not purchase goods. From the 1730s on, an increasingly loud chorus of patriots that argued against slavery in general, and the slave trade in particular, for its immorality and its disastrous economic consequences. Slave societies, they argued, could not be a consumer society. And Adam Smith said in particular, the work done by free men comes cheaper in the end than those performed by slaves. But now, of course, we have all these debt slaves, and remember a lot of the discussion going on right now is the economic conundrum of why, despite the fact that gasoline prices collapsed in the U.S., why has there been no more consumption?
Right. Why are the sales of Walmart and McDonald's going down? Because the people at Walmart are not living what they call it a living wage. But what the truth about it is they are being paid a slave wage. They're being paid a stipend from Walmart, and if they didn't get a subsidy from the federal government, the United States government, they would be exactly equivalent to a slave wage, and therefore there's nothing left over for them to buy stuff at Walmart. And Walmart is the biggest employer in America, second maybe only to the military. And Henry Ford figured this out many years ago when he gave everybody in the plant a raise so they could go out and buy a Ford car.
Yeah.
But the Walmart people are so conniving and so bankrupt intellectually and emotionally and spiritually, and they're such a rapacious force on the spirit of America that it's hard to even believe how the federal government allows these Benedict Arnolds at the Walmart family to even live in America.
Well, it's a debate that was going on for the past hundreds of years, and sometimes the winner, America became a huge country and a successful economic powerhouse because they cut off from the austerers over here. Now, I want to do a quick headline and then go back to it because there's a headline here: every single part of Los Angeles is unaffordable and $15 an hour. Los Angeles just voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2020, but still, that's not enough money even today, let alone in 2020, to afford anywhere to live in Los Angeles across the entire huge city, of sprawling city. But going back to what Adam Smith said about the colonies at the time, he said, had the British government pursued measures to support the colonies rather than austerity policies that retarded their growth, Smith believed the American economy would have been so dynamic that in little more than a century, the seat of the empire would then naturally remove itself to its most economically dynamic region, North America. So the headquarters of the empire could right now be in America somewhere, but instead they chose to lose it.
Right, because Westminster opted for short-term gains over long-term value. And then they got really persnickety and nasty and rapacious when they realized that they made an egregious error.
Well, the same could be said as we look across Europe now, where the similar situations of debt to GDP in Greece, I said it's 175%. Spain is like Portugal is like 137%. Spain is lower at 94%. But they're imposing huge austerity on their economic bloc, their empire, as it were, is going to disintegrate, and it could be bloody like the American Revolution.
Instead of, for the American GDP to grow sufficiently to pay down their debt, which is now almost $20 trillion, they would encourage immigration and raise the minimum wage.
Yeah.
But because the Walmart family and Warren Buffett and the McDonald's Corporation and Coca-Cola is into, for the short-term pop of a stock option play, they're willing to flush the country down the toilet, and according to the founding fathers of America, we know what they say about that.
But even worse, forget America because they've got their own, independence. They still have more independence than Greece. Greece is the story that we're looking at, and Greece is the sort of violence being imposed upon them of the people there. The collapse of their economy, the ongoing crisis, the humanitarian crisis is something that you will see, like a declaration of independence, and beyond, we don't know what's going to happen after that.
Well, I totally support Greece declaring their independence from the EU and the International Monetary Fund and the kleptocrats in Brussels. Of course I do. I'll be down in Athens soon to show you my support. I love you. We got to go.
Declare your independence, Greece.
It's the only way to go. You too, Scotland. Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to return to Liam Halligan.
I'm back.
He's a columnist for The Telegraph and their shady deals with HSBC. And he's also editor-at-large for BNE.eu. Welcome back.
Europe. Hi, Max.
All right, now, we were just chatting in the previous episode, so I wanted to get right back into it. I was calling for Scotland to rise up and declare independence from the United Kingdom, of course, is a natural move to do because the English Parliament, the English people, the English lawmakers, David Cameron, George Osborne, they have allowed, with impunity, banks like HSBC and Barclays to get away with admitted criminal behavior with no kind of fine or penalty or jail term whatsoever. This is tyranny. You've allowed the plutocrats to control your economy using instruments of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett called them. Financial terrorism. Rife in the House of Commons. Now, based on that alone, I would think Scotland would want to distance itself from the terrorists in Parliament.
I very much agree with the need for root and branch bank reform in this country. I've been banging on about the need to split investment banks and commercial banks in the Telegraph for many, many years, been pilloried for it by a lot of members of the mainstream media establishment. But, I don't see that links necessarily to Scottish independence. If you look
because you're creating a two-tier justice system. How can you have an economy and a society where the top is breaking laws with impunity? They're not just civil laws. It's criminal behavior. And they get nothing in kind of penalty-wise, and everyone else is going to jail if you steal a stick of gum at the local corner shop.
you won't find anybody in the UK who believes stronger than I do in the need for a proper flushing out of the banking system, more transparency of balance sheets and all the rest of it. I totally agree with you. But just have a look at the structure of the British banking system. In your country, the US, the combined bank balance sheets are 1 times annual GDP. In our country, here in the UK, combined bank balance sheets are 5 or 6 times GDP. We have a massively top-heavy banking sector here in the UK. In Iceland, when that went bang, the combined bank balance sheets was 7 times annual GDP.
But they use that as a weapon to hold at the throat of Cameron and say, if you don't let us continue to steal money, we're going to crash your system. That's terrorism.
Even more top-heavy than the UK bank system as a whole is the Scottish bank system as a whole. If you take Scotland as it currently is, the bank balance sheet combined of all the Scottish banks is 12 times Scotland's current annual GDP. And here's my concern.
The Royal Bank of Scotland.
Here's my
Royal Bank of Scotland,
and
which under the auspices of the laws in Westminster have been allowed to go out on a limb and do the worst of the possible of the worst. Don't blame Scotland because the Royal Bank of Scotland is the worst criminal of them all.
Here is my concern, Max, okay? When RBS did its disastrous deal with ABN AMRO, the politician that championed that more than any was Alex Salmond and the SNP. They saw it as a sort of symbol of Scottish virility that they were going to have the biggest bank in the world. My fear is this: an independent Scotland with a massively top-heavy banking system will engage in a regulatory race to the bottom with the City of London. The banking sector in Scotland will get even less regulated, and Scotland and England will compete in order to attract bank business by lowering the regulatory barriers even more. Then you have a situation where Scotland could get in serious trouble financially with a very top-heavy banking system, and the rest of the world will expect the rest of the UK to bail Scotland out. So you will have a massive moral hazard amongst the Scottish banking elite and the Scottish political elite to ramp up their banking sector like crazy, knowing that the rest of the world will expect, when it comes to it, London to bail out a busted Scottish banking system. That is a big danger. That is a big moral hazard.
2 points. You can't get any worse than the current regulatory framework in England.
Oh, I think we can.
No,
even though it's terrible. They
have transgressed any possible barriers to committing fraud with things like multiple and infinite rehypothecation. I'm not defending it for a second. Number one. So you can't get any worse. It's like once you chop off all 10 fingers, there's not another finger to chop off. That's it. And they're at that state. There's nobody worse than Osborne and Cameron and Mark Carney's cesspool of regulatory nightmare that they have right there in the City of London and in Westminster. Second of all, Scotland's got more than £1 trillion worth of revenue from the oil, from North Sea oil. Okay, that's Scotland's oil. 90% of the revenue go to Scotland. They can very easily refinance, recap, do a deal with Russia or China and pay down that debt pronto. They've got the assets. They've got the oil. They've got a great dynamic infrastructure for startups. That game what they're driving around and auto.
Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto.
That's an old one, Max. You're showing your age.
That's
Crikey.
from Scotland.
That's from Atari days.
Those guys can pump out GDP growth. It's created dynamics. You said just on this show 6 months ago that if Scotland were separate and it was based on GDP to population, it would be the richest country in the world, including Qatar. You said that on this show.
I think you'll find, Max, if we go back through the archives, that was a bloke called Dominic Frisby. Okay, it wasn't me.
Okay, fair enough. Let's get Dominic back on the show.
I'll give him a call.
I'll stand in for Dominic. According to Dominic Frisby,
buy gold, buy Bitcoin.
I guessed on this show, Scotland would have the highest GDP per capita of any country in the world if it's separated from the UK. Look, those numbers are good numbers.
Max,
They're just a guess was maybe confused.
I'm a Celt, okay? I'm an Irish citizen as well as a British citizen. Of course, I see huge romance in the idea of Scotland being independent. from England. But the fact is that Scottish people get a great deal from their membership of the Union since 1707. There's this thing called the Barnett Formula, which basically dishes out huge amounts of money from the rest of the UK to Scotland. They get massive subsidies. A lot of what's driving Scottish independence, in my view, is a political elite that wants all the trappings of nationhood and the ministerial cars and the red boxes and all the rest of it, and they're promising outlays that they just can't deliver. Not least because so much of their economic policy is the link to the price of one commodity, oil, which, as we've seen in the last 6 months, is on a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the same argument
very
posed to the founders of the United States of America back in the day, 1776, and that era, where the Tories or the Whigs or whoever was running the Queen or the King, whatever
England was terrorizing America. England had colonized America. England was
boosting America until they imposed austerity.
Was
3 years before the Revolution.
Financially exploiting what was going on in America. Just as the English oppressed the Irish,
austerity.
Which is why the Irish wanted to leave the UK, because they were colonised and there was tyranny. But there's nothing of that kind of relationship between England and Scotland. On the contrary, there's an extremely productive working relationship between England and Scotland, where the Scots get the much better end of the fiscal deal. And how about this?
They get subjected to the short end of austerity.
How about Scots living in England who can't vote on independence? I know dozens and dozens of Scots living in this town in London who've grown up in Scotland. They've come down here to London for a few years to further their career, and they want to go back to Scotland, and they can't actually vote on Scottish independence.
So
That's
Liam,
crazy.
what percentage pop in over the last 5 years have we seen in the property market in Glasgow?
Of course.
What? Tell me. No. Tell me that number.
It's you know, I know property prices in Scotland have been weak. I know they've been weak.
That sounds like a negative number.
Well,
it's going down.
Of course.
Because they're not the beneficiary of what's happening in the Bank of England. They should be independent.
That in 7 of 9 British regions over the last 5 years, house prices have yet to fully recover from pre-subprime levels.
Near to Scotland.
No, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
That's right, because Bank of England, and right around here within a 5-mile radius, they get dished out money all day long for free.
That's an argument
for democracy.
So that's an argument to build more houses in the southeast so you don't have such an imbalanced property market, as I've been saying for years.
What Osborne says, the problem is you all here down in the southeast looking for a home, you just need to move to Birmingham.
I think there should be more encouragement made for people to move out the southeast.
When do they start putting them on cattle cars and shipping them to Poland? Look, what kind of mentality suggests that just put them on a train and ship them somewhere and we'll forget about them? You're creating a ghetto. That's social cleansing. That's not an economic policy.
You believe in the market. You're meant to be a capitalist.
What market when you have the Bank of England setting interest rates at 0? That's not a market, is it?
I'm talking about the housing. I'm talking about the housing market, Max. The housing market. If houses are cheaper
by government,
in the Midlands or in the north, then of course people should move. Of course they should move. If there are jobs and livelihoods up there for them, of course they should. My family's been moving around the world for generations following economic incentives. It's a completely honourable and often necessary thing to do. And clearly a lot of youngsters particularly are getting priced out of homes in London and the South East.
Because you're just flailing about and I feel sorry for you. So let's move on. During the election...
I'm just trying to follow your illogical line of questioning.
Osborne promised to seize private property for housing associations by forcing them to sell to tenants at a taxpayer-subsidized discount. That's in the Southeast. Where's that in Scotland? Where's that in the North? He's stealing property from housing associations. It's not his to take. It's privately owned. He's stealing the money and forcing them to sell at a discount. That's Osborne. That's in London. Where do we see that in Scotland? Where do we see that kind of subsidy, that kind of love in the property market anywhere else in this country?
The reality is because our housing market is so lopsided, because our economy is so focused on the southeast, partly because of financial services, as you said.
Because they get free money from the Bank of England.
But partly for other reasons. There are some parts of the UK where you literally can't give houses away, where they're just
because they're not being subsidized by Westminster. If Westminster said you were going to subsidize the entire country's housing market with these gifts and these appropriations and reassignments, I mean, this is social cleansing, not a social policy. Now, we got about a minute left. And, while, of course, all the rhetoric from number 10 Downing Street is that, we're better together, Meanwhile, Cameron wants to hightail. What's going to happen with this EU vote? They're going to do a referendum to be in or out of the EU.
Yeah.
We got about a minute left. Your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, Cameron promised before the election a referendum on EU membership in 2017 because actually a lot of the new Tory party in Parliament, particularly the new intake who are MPs for the first time, they've had to fight off UKIP. UKIP came second in a lot of seats that the Tories won, and they came third in a lot of seats too. A lot of these new Tory MPs are actually really Eurosceptic, so they're pushing for a referendum even earlier in 2016. It's now almost certain there will be an EU referendum on UK
How do you think it's going to go?
EU membership. I think that in the end, if there's a proper negotiation with Europe and UK does get some concessions, and I'm sure other countries will want them too, the Finns, maybe the Dutch as well, then I think in the end, most British people want to be in the EU, but they want to be in a quite seriously reformed EU.
Does Germany want Britain in the EU?
I think Germany wants to use Britain to try and negotiate some of the things that Germany hasn't got the guts to negotiate, but given its very complex relationship with Europe and its need to be seen as a good European and not rocking the boat. So there is massive clamour in Germany
all right.
for a lot of the things that the UK
Germany's
is
going
trying
to
to
stick
push
it to Cameron. I guarantee you. Take it to the bank. You can make money on that. All right, Lee Maligan, thanks for being once again on the Keiser Report.
Cheers.
See you at Kilconomics.
Kilconomics.
All right, that's it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Lee Maligan. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.